Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at your academy. When I first received the invitation, I looked up what was happening with this Oikos Academy, and I went to the website and I viewed the video that was on the website. And what really made me want to come and take part was when I heard something that the young man in the video said, whose name I believe was Michael. He said, my university did not prepare me for the world of complexity. And that's exactly what I feel about a lot of education that goes on, certainly in the UK and in a lot of other places around the world as well. So I'm delighted to come along, and I felt that having worked in education for sustainability for many years, that in some ways, or in many ways really, that education for sustainability is actually a response to and trying to address a lot of the things that are represented by the term VUCA world. So I've been teaching for quite some time. I started my teaching in a secondary school that was 11 years old to 18 years old in the UK. And that was back in the 1980s. And I felt then that even the school education was not preparing those young people in the way that it could be for a very uncertain and very changeable and dynamic future. And I've continued to work on this for many years. And over the last 20 years, I've been involved in the master's program at London South Bank University, which was a master's degree in education for sustainability. And that's a 1-year full-time course or a 3-year part-time course. So there's a lot to say about education for sustainability, and we only have a short period of time. So this is what I intend to do, if I can get that slides to move on, to cover in this session. And what I'm hoping to do is give a little bit of breadth by looking at two of the sort of areas of assumptions that underpin education for sustainable development, and that's sustainable development itself and education, where we're coming from with regard to those two things behind the idea of education for sustainable development. And then, although there are many, many characteristics that I could talk about in relation to education for sustainable development, I'm going to focus on 3 because of our limited time: systems thinking, crossing discipline boundaries, and a view of knowledge that is emergent. And I might just say that I don't think anything that I'm going to say is going to greatly contradict what you've just heard from Michael, the previous speaker. I think there's a lot of synergy between what he said and what I'm going to say. And while we're looking at these things, what I want you to think about is how they can contribute through higher education to preparing you as students and future students for living in this challenging VUCA world. So we'll finish off with a brief look at how we might bring change to higher education institutions. And then I very much going to allow time at the end and hopefully get some questions to come back from you who are listening, and we can have hopefully a short discussion at the end and perhaps pick up on a few things. If anybody else can monitor the chat while it's going on, and I'll certainly have a look at the end if anybody puts any questions into the chat, maybe that's the way we can get things started on the discussion. Okay, so let's move on and start by looking at these 2 areas of assumptions. So sustainable development. I'm sure if you're part of this academy, it's something that you've thought about and are familiar with the debates around sustainable development, the sustainable development goals. I'm sure that's something that you're quite familiar with. I just want to make the point that from education for a sustainability perspective, and from where I'm coming from, that the view of sustainable development is that there are ecological limits. So within our world, we have various systems, lots of different systems, but everything has to be contained within the physical ecological limits of the planet. Within that, humans have developed social systems, animals have developed social systems, humans have developed economic systems, and many other systems as well. But these three terms, ecological systems, the environment, social systems, society, and economics, are often seen as the three sort of key areas of sustainable development. And the point I'm trying to make here is that they're all interrelated and they all merge into each other, but there are actual ecological limits that we shouldn't go beyond. And although the Earth is not a closed system, as you're aware, we have solar radiation coming in from outside, which is really the main source of all energy, past and present and future. It's a combination of that solar energy and what happens on planet Earth that we have in terms of resources to support life on Earth. At the moment, there isn't anything else. So although we're an open system in some respects, there are limits, and it's a lot of work has been done on understanding this, and I'll just give you a couple of examples that you can follow up on if you wish to do so in the future. Global Footprint Network is an organization that works on the idea of the ecological footprint. And you can do your own ecological footprint. You can do an ecological footprint for an organization, for a whole country, or even you can do the global ecological footprint. And that's how we arrive at this idea of, at the moment, overall, humanity is actually using more resources than exist on one planet, on the planet that we have. Not all of humanity, it varies right across the world, as we know. Some are using much less than a planet's worth. Some societies are using much more than a planet's worth. But it can be measured, we can see it. And an ecological footprint gives you the idea that every year there is productivity from planet Earth, combined with the solar radiation, with agriculture, plant growth, all sorts of things that we could live off. But we tend to go beyond those limits. Another model that has been developed that tries to get across the idea that we are living beyond our limits is the planetary boundaries model. And again, by searching planetary boundaries on the internet, you can find out all about this. There are, in the model that's been developed, there are 9 planetary boundaries which are linked to the Earth systems that support life on Earth, and particularly humanity's life on Earth. And it identifies the safe boundaries that we need those systems to be within if we are going to continue to live on into the future. And not, if we go beyond those, we are starting to undermine the systems upon which we actually depend for life. So there's a couple of examples. So this idea that from a sustainable development perspective, there are limits, and we should be living in a way that recognizes those limits and lives within those limits. So that's the assumption underpinning from a sustainable perspective. And then ESD is linked to a particular view of education. Now, that from an education perspective, there are many different ideas about what education is for. And looking back in history and looking around the world, you'll see different models of education. At one extreme, you can see education as moving knowledge from one place into students. A model of a teacher that is transferring knowledge into students, students learn and gather that knowledge. But there's obviously a lot more models of education than just that. And from an ESD perspective, we recognize that education is not value neutral, and that the learning context and the learning process should reflect the values being taught. And we'll come back to this when we're thinking about changing higher education. But essentially what it's saying is that the institution of which you are a part as a student should reflect what is being taught. So if you're being taught about sustainable development, then the practices within that institution as a whole should reflect sustainable development. Also, this view of education, ESD view of education, sees education as a transformative process, which is expanding an individual's worldview. And it's linking back to what Michael, the previous speaker, was saying. It's very much about a co-learning experience, a view of education which is co-learning with your peers, but also with your tutors. And finally, just in this concise summary of what an ESD view of education might be like, every student is on an individual learning journey. They're part of the community of learning, but their own journeys are all going to be slightly unique in whatever way. And that learning journey should prepare them for learning beyond a particular course in higher education, whatever. It takes the skills of learning, of how to learn with them and beyond, to deal with that uncertain world, the changes that are going to come, the extra things they need to learn, and so on. So that's kind of a broad view of where we're coming from in terms of education for sustainability, both in terms of sustainable development and also education. So let's now have a look at these three particular characteristics that I've chosen to look at. And the first one is the idea of systems thinking. And so to start with, just think about, what is the difference between a group of things and a system? Well, we can assemble a group of things. They don't necessarily interact. The key thing about the system is the fact that the connections between the elements of a system, the things that make up that system, those relationships, those connections are as important as the individual things themselves. Understanding those relationships are important in understanding the system as a whole, as well as understanding the individual. And why do we put so much emphasis on this in education for sustainable development? Well, I'd like to just share a quote from this book, Thinking in Systems, by Donella Meadows. Everybody else's picture is across part of my screen. I'm just moving that so I can see the quote myself. And Donella Meadows wrote quite a lot on systems thinking and the systems perspective on the world. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us, but this particular book, I think, is a very useful introduction to the idea of systems thinking. But I think this quote from the beginning, near the beginning of the book, is very important. She says, "I don't think that the systems way of seeing is better than the reductionist way of seeing or thinking. I think it's complementary and therefore revealing. Each way of seeing allows our knowledge of the wondrous world in which we live to become a little more complete. And the reason that it features quite strongly in education for sustainable development is that because most of the traditional education systems, and probably the systems that you've experienced to date as students when you were at school, certainly when I was at school, it was a reductionist model of education. And by that, I mean, we studied mathematics, and then there was a change of lesson, and we might study geography, and a change of lesson, and we might study biology. But we didn't put things together in the school system that I was in. They were very separate. And we need both. But we have the reductionist system that is dominant in most education systems, certainly the ones that I'm familiar with. And we want to bring the systems thinking into that. And again, we'll see a little bit more about that as I go through what I've got to say here. But just to illustrate that a little bit more, couple of examples. How do we understand what a frog is? Let's take the frog as an example. It's full of it's got its own internal systems. You can take an animal like a frog and you can put it into a laboratory. You can study it in isolation. You might even want to study its internal system, how it feeds, what it does with its food, how it, what its organs are, and so on, and understand how that all links together. But you don't really understand what a frog is until you've seen it in its habitat, in its environment, how it connects to that habitat, to the plants that it depends on, to the other animals that it interacts with, and so on. So to really understand the frog, you need both the systems perspective, but also you can learn a lot from the reductionist perspective as well. And I've just thrown another example in here. Take a school. How do we understand a school? Well, a school has lots of internal systems, has a curriculum, has a staffing system, management system, all sorts of things internally that you need to understand. But that school, to fully understand it, how does it fit into the education system of which it is a part? And it's influencing those systems beyond. It's preparing citizens for the future of the political system and the social system of which it's a part. The cultural system of which it's a part is going to have an impact on the sorts of things that go on in that school. So it's this idea of systems thinking, seeing those connections, understanding that there are internal systems and there are external systems. And when you want to study something in a reductionist way, you need to draw some boundaries around what you're studying, but never lose sight of the fact that there are connections coming in and going out of those boundaries while you're focusing on what's there centrally. So getting that systems thinking gives you this systems perspective on the world. And interestingly, just try a little experiment here. Once you've got that perspective, it's difficult to lose it, and you start to see things. So it may be when you're shopping for food or something, but you start to look at the food and think, well, where did that come from? Is this a sustainable piece, source of food? And so on. And I'll just try this, and hopefully I'm going to bring your images back down the side. I'm going to put an image up on the screen and see if you can tell me what you see, or at least I'll help you. We haven't got a lot of time. I'll help you. There is. Can anybody see a word on the screen? I'm going to bring it. You can wave or say if you can see it or not. I can't see you all at the moment.
I see fly, I think.
You do. Well done. Now, some of you may be able to see the word fly, F-L-Y, on the screen. And once you've seen it, it's difficult to unsee it. But some of you may be still struggling to see that, and that's fine. It was just a little demonstration to say okay, when you get a certain perspective, you can see things that you couldn't see previously. And when you achieve that perspective, then it's difficult to unsee those things. So that was just a little mini experiment there. So that's the systems thinking as an element of education for sustainability. Now, crossing disciplinary boundaries, bringing different perspective. And also, I should say, I wanted you to keep thinking about, all this in relation to the VUCA world. And certainly systems thinking can help us deal with the complexity that is out there in the world. It's one way of achieving a more of a holistic perspective, and therefore starting to see the complexity. And all these three things that I'm talking about, the systems thinking, crossing disciplinary boundaries, and also the final one on emergent knowledge, they're all related to these, and as you'll see now. So, crossing disciplinary boundaries, well, we all know what separate disciplines look like. And as I mentioned a little while ago, certainly a lot of secondary schools very much have a divided curriculum. And nowhere do they put all that different learning in different disciplines together in the way that it exists out there in the wider world. We can have multidisciplinary approaches where we recognize two different disciplines, but we tend to keep them, we work in one discipline, but we're able to then work in another discipline. Fine. We can have interdisciplinary approaches to problems and study and so on, where elements cross between disciplinary boundaries, or two disciplines work together, bringing things together. Or we can have transdisciplinary approaches, where those boundaries start to merge, they merge away completely, and the overlap and the disciplines become much more integrated. And we probably, at times, we need all of these approaches. And you can think about this when you see different professions sometimes working on projects. And it may be a big development project somewhere, and you've got the engineers, and you've got the social scientists working with the people and so on. And if they fail to see each other's perspective, it can become problematic. So we need to recognize that these disciplinary boundaries break down, because that is what is happening in our complex world. Though, the world, when we look out there, isn't all nicely divided up into separate disciplines which we can step in to one to another. Things are interrelated tremendously. And then I'll just come on to the third characteristic that I want to talk about this morning, and that is a view of knowledge as being emergent. And I have to say that this can be a real problem, particularly even in the world of education. And some teachers find this a real problem as well, because a lot of people like certainty, and they like to think that something they know is actually as it is, and very often that is the case. We can use the best available knowledge to make decisions, but we should also recognize, and this is something that education systems do not do well enough in my view, we should prepare people for uncertainty, that knowledge changes over time. And there are plenty of examples, there's some very significant examples of this, including, if we go back in history, to the Copernican revolution, certainly in Western Europe, where there was a change. The dominant view for many, many years was that the Earth was at the center and that the sun went round the Earth. And it took a long time for that shift to take place, where the dominant view is that the sun was at the center of our solar system and the planets were actually revolving around the sun. And it was very controversial. And Galileo at the time who was one of the earlier people to think and recognize that the planets were actually revolving around the sun, suffered tremendously within his own community and society for holding that view, because it was contrary to the dominant view at the time. And that's just, that was a major shift, but there are many other shifts as well. Our shifts in scientific knowledge keep progressing. So what people learned in terms of physics in the 1960s is very different to what they would learn today, and what they learn today would contradict some of that learning from way back in the 1960s. So there are things like the precautionary principle that help to prepare us for those changes, for that uncertainty that will emerge going further forward in the future. And that is what I was talking about when we talked about the idea of an education system that doesn't just teach you for the now, but actually prepares you to carry on learning in the future to deal with those changes that might come. So they're the three characteristics that I picked up on, but as I said, there are many more characteristics to education for sustainability, as I'm sure some of you know about. So just a brief word then on changing higher education institutions. There are many different models to institutional change, but when it comes to implementing education for sustainable development, there's quite a bit of consensus around the things that need to happen. How they happen, there's many different ideas about how that might come about, and I'll just give you one in a moment. But the whole institutional approach means that everything needs to be in sync with each other. So going right back to the beginning, where I talked about education and the fact that the institution should reflect the values and the practices of what the learning in the institution was trying to get across to the students in that institution. So within the institution, you've got your teaching and learning, which is central to what the institution is about. But the institutional management should reflect what is being taught. So if we're teaching about sustainability and sustainable development in the institution, the practices of the institution, the procurement of food or any other materials, the management of and disposal and recycling of any waste, and so all those things, the management of any grounds that might be there, should reflect the sustainable development that is being taught and so on. It's really important to have commitment and leadership that is actually in tune with sustainable development if the whole institution is going to reflect sustainable development. So that's absolutely critical. Sustainability and sustainable development is context specific very often. So what might appear to be a good sustainable development solution in one context might be very different in another part of the globe, another part of the world. So embedding links into communities and partnerships is an important part of creating an institution that can be considered to be, oriented towards sustainable development and an ESD solution. And as we've said about knowledge being emergent, things need to be continually researched and monitored because changes might need to be made. What might be the right solution, the right approach, the right thing to be teaching and delivering in terms of teaching and learning at one point might change in the future. And that needs constant monitoring, constant research and updating. And all these things need joining up. So there is a common practice, a common approach throughout the institution. So that's a model, and there are different models, but you'll find if you're looking at how education for sustainable development needs to be implemented in an educational institution, these things crop up. They're quite common throughout the different models. And when it comes to actually bringing about those changes, I just give you one example which you can look up in more detail. And it's been around for some time now, Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline Model. And there's a number of publications around this model and this model of change. But his model has 5 disciplines that the organization needs, and the people who make up that organization need to be engaged with. And at the center is systems thinking, which we've spent some time talking about in this session. But what his model attempts to do is to create an organization that becomes a learning organization. And we don't just mean that in the sense that it's teaching students. What we mean is the organization as a whole is learning and changing and developing as it goes. And therefore it can respond to the changes in this uncertain world and the ambiguities in this uncertain world. Okay. I said that I would speak for about 30 minutes and then hopefully get some questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see if we can see if there are any questions in about any of the things that I've raised there.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Doctor. You mentioned something, regarding the different approaches in achieving sustainable development. But what came to my mind was considering, how life is in this part of the country. For instance, in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there is a goal, that is related to, gender equality. So, considering the social aspect of life here, it's something that is not really common, gender equality, and it's something that it's going to be difficult to adopt. This is just an instance. Another thing is, considering the economic situation and the poor living standard of a country, or maybe in this region, a lot of people engage in activities that mostly affect, sustainability in general. For instance, cutting down of trees to produce firewood, coal, and all of that. So, these are, limits and detriments to achieving sustainability. And I don't know if you have some suggestions, you can share with us in addressing these, especially in this part of the world.
I wouldn't. You are the expert in your part of the world, and I wouldn't comment specifically on what's happening in your part of the world. It wouldn't be right for me to do so. But there are some principles that I recognize in what you're saying. First of all, to say that I could have picked diversity and equality as a key element of education for sustainability. It's a crucial part because it needs to be an inclusive approach to education education for sustainability. It needs that inclusive approach, and it is challenging to achieve that. I can share some experiences of mine. I spent 2 years as an advisory teacher in a part of the United Kingdom, which involved promoting gender equality and diversity generally. And there are there is a lot of good material out there that can help with that, but it is a challenge, and it's something that takes a lot of time to shift people's perspectives in that way. More immediate, although that's a really crucial element, but immediate, I picked up on what you were saying about, people's challenges to survive, maintaining a sustainable livelihood, and the cutting down of trees, which is not, necessarily, and often we need to look at in terms of short-term and long-term thinking. And I have to say, in many parts of the world, when economic hardships hit, what we tend to think of in terms of sustainable development practices often suffer, in spite of the fact that they are often the solution to the long-term outcomes of that economic hardship. But it is a difficult challenge to get people to shift their behavior from thinking about immediate survival to thinking about longer term survival of generations to come in some cases. And we can see that happening on a global scale at the moment. I mean, I now have grandchildren, and I worry greatly for them in terms of what's happening with climate change and so on. And yet the people in power are not taking, in my view, sufficient urgent action to address that. I'm not helped. If you wanted to talk in detail about some of the ideas for promoting gender equality, I remember developing some materials, and it was around stories. And I'll just give you one very, very brief example, because I know we're short of time. But there was a story called My Son, My Son. And this was in a UK context now. And we used to tell the story to teachers because there was a terrible accident, and the child was on his way to school with the father, and the child was hurt terribly, and the father took the child and raced to the hospital. The doctor came out of the hospital and saw what was happening, saw this child coming towards them, being carried by the father, and the doctor said, my son, what has happened? And it used to take a long time for the penny to drop. Why was the doctor saying, my son, when the father was carrying the... It's because the doctor was his mother. It's a female doctor. And in times gone by, that, getting across that perspective, out the mindset, shifting people's mindset, that gender roles have changed and they're changing. And I'm sure we could, in your part of the world, you could construct a story that was relevant and might challenge people's mindsets in that part of the world.
Thank you for that. Okay. Thank you for that, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn.
I believe, there is one question.
Yes, we have a question in the chat box.
Okay.
From Ahmad Wali. His question is, hello, sir. If I understand, sir, you are saying that the universities or institutions should review their ways or strategies from time to time?
Absolutely. Quite a few universities in the UK work on 5-year strategies, but with updates during those 5 years as well. And absolutely, they should be reviewed during the time, and they need to have principles around sustain. If they're aspiring to be a sustainable development institution, they need to have principles on which that strategy is based. But the political landscape, the economic landscape in which they are operating is not going to stand still. It's going to shift. And the requirements that students need in terms of their education and preparation, as we've been talking about this morning, because of the way things are shifting in the world around them, that needs to change as well. And unfortunately, those shifting some of those things does take some time. So absolutely, it's crucial to not only develop a strategy for a fixed period of time with regular reviews within that, because things can change quite rapidly, but also preparing your next period, your strategy for your next period as well is absolutely important. And I get very frustrated with this. And I one of the areas that is beyond often the institution's control to some extent, if they are providing courses which are accredited by professional bodies in some cases that sit beyond the university, it can take a long time to get those professional bodies to shift their accreditation requirements to keep up with the fast changes that are happening in the world around them. And I've seen examples of that certainly before.
All right, thank you. Ahmed, I hope that answers your question. We also have another question from Abdullahi Mukhtar. Hello, sir. Should gender equality be based on the culture, norms, and values of a particular country?
Wow, that's a tough question. Obviously, wherever you are in the world, there is a cultural context, but there are some basic principles of equality as well. And I would say that those basic principles are probably going to be fairly universal, but how you implement or you achieve change in a particular cultural context is going to be very different from one to another, because you can't dismiss or ignore that cultural context. If you want to achieve what we're talking about is shifting people's mindsets, shifting people's perspectives on how they see the world, and their cultural context is going to have had a massive influence on that mindset that they hold. And so if there are changes that need to be made to get closer to the universal values of equality and so on, it's no good. It's not something that you really want to achieve by pushing people, forcing people into shifting. That doesn't work. You've got to shift. You've got to take the people with you, and you've got to demonstrate the value of seeing things differently. And that will happen. That will be different from one country to another. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Any other question?
I would have a question.
Hello, Michael.
So, because you were just also mentioning the shifting mindsets, and this is what it is about, and you shared that example of that picture where we could see fly, but as soon as we see fly, it's hard to forget. If I can take away one thing from this presentation, what are you unlearning right now, and what are your tips on doing so?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question, Mike. I've been trying to shift my perspective and move in what I thought the area I wanted to move in for many years. What am I unlearning right now? In some ways, I'm still unlearning how we approach education. And I think the climate and the ecological emergencies that we find ourselves in, I feel that, I've been trying to contribute to shifting people's mindsets to deal with those and to prevent the worst effects of those for a long, long time. And in some ways, I have to say that I think I haven't done enough. Could I have done more? I've failed. And I'm engaging now with the idea that direct action, non-violent direct action, is actually something that maybe we need to do to get that move to happen. So that's putting me in quite a transitional position at the minute about how I'm seeing things in the world. Tips for doing it is well, I think you need to find space for yourself in the broadest sense of the word. Time, but also a place. And one tip that I would, if you're fortunate to have any sort of green space, if you're in an urban area, if you've got a park, or if you're not in an urban area and you can get out into a natural space of some sort, that's a great place to spend some time regularly to try and think about how you're shifting, what you're thinking about. I'm sorry, I can't say any more than that on that. Okay, well, I believe we're according to my clock, we're pretty much exactly on time.
Yes, we are. We are very much on time. Thank you, Dr. Gallen, for such a wonderful presentation and for taking out time to answer most of the questions that were asked and for having time to present to us. With that being said, I think we'll go for a stretch out, 10 minutes, and see you back at 12 o'clock.
I'd just like to say thank you very much for being there and for listening to what I had to say, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of this academy.
Actually, the pleasure is ours, sir. Thank you very much for joining and for the wonderful contributions. We hope to collaborate more in the future, in terms of achieving the objectives that we have in place. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
But you're very welcome. This is a new experience for me in terms of oikos. I'm not that familiar with it. I found it very interesting looking at the things you do. I've been doing a bit of research before preparing the presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for your time. Goodbye, sir.